My name is Gustav Straub. I received the Fulbright Prize in American Studies 2022 for a dissertation that engages with contemporary indigenous cinema. So essentially, I looked at films by indigenous filmmakers from the countries we now know as the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And I specifically analyzed ways in which these filmmakers show indigenous women in their work. So I looked at strategies of representation and how they differ from often very negative colonial views that we get in mainstream cinema. I've come to this topic both through personal interest and intellectual curiosity, and both of those factors date back to the year 2011. Back then, I was a BA student at Heidelberg University in Germany, and I was given the opportunity to go to Australia for 1 year, and I did study abroad exchange at a small university in Melbourne, where I was able to focus, at least to some degree, on questions about indigeneity. So I, for example, took a class on Aboriginal history in Australia and a class on post-colonial literatures in Australia. And it was in those classes that I was confronted with questions and intellectual debates concerning indigeneity in settler nation states like Australia, but also like the United States, Canada, or New Zealand. So we spoke about frictions that still exist, about racial inequality that still exists and continues to disadvantage indigenous peoples disproportionately in settler nation states, but also addressed indigenous resistance and questions of indigenous resurgence on the political level, but also through creative means. In those classes, I also got to meet indigenous students who at the time were about the same age as I was, and at a point in their life where they became politically more engaged in becoming activists and fighting not only against structural inequalities, but also for indigenous rights. And ultimately, I took all of those impressions back with me to Europe. They accompanied me through both the final stages of my BA program and my MA, which I did at Salzburg University, and ultimately led me to do this dissertation project that has a trans-indigenous focus on indigenous filmmaking from the Anglophone regions. So this is how I came to this topic. I hope my work is not perceived as white saviorism, but of course the question about ethical research practices is an incredibly important one. And it's especially important for researchers like me. I am a white person, a white man working out of Europe, and in my dissertation project I sought to center indigenous perspectives. That comes with obligations, and I would say the first obligation is to be aware of the long history of Eurocentric research on indigenous communities, a long history of research that continues to have damaging effects on these indigenous communities today. And accordingly, the second obligation is to be aware of how to do it better. Good starting points for finding out about ethical research on indigenous communities or indigenous issues more generally are books by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith. She's a Maori scholar and has written a very useful work called Decolonizing Methodologies. There's Cui and Solto, scholar called Margaret Kovac, who's written a book about indigenous methodologies, and there's many, many more. So this is the first, these are the first works to go to. Then what was also always very important to me was to go out and test my ideas at academic conferences where I was, where I knew that there would be indigenous scholars or indigenous studies scholars to give feedback on my arguments. And what goes along with that is to be open to feedback. It's important if somebody tells you to reconsider things because they sound Eurocentric or they sound problematic, to not take criticism personally, but to actually listen and integrate criticism in your work or try to use the criticism to improve work. That's what good research is, not only in that field, but I guess more generally. To recommend only 5 Indigenous films is difficult because there are so many good works out there, but here's a list of 4 feature films and 1 TV show. My first recommendation is Blackfoot and Sami filmmaker Elimaya Tailfeathers and Kathleen Hepburn's film The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open. The Body Remembers stages a chance encounter of 2 very different Indigenous women in the city of Vancouver. The film is noteworthy because it is one of the few films that brings urban Indigenous identities onto the screen, and specifically it very skillfully negotiates the identities of Indigenous women in city spaces. It does so by a complex and well-developed narrative, but it also does so by using film technique. It presents their story almost in real time with very few cuts, so most of the film seems to be a single long take. So the film, for this nuance, for the complexity that it provides, is highly recommended. The second film I'm recommending is a film by the late Mi'kmaq filmmaker Jeff Barnaby called Rhymes for Young Ghouls. Rhymes is a film about a rebellion. It's set in the past on a fictional Mi'kmaq reserve in the 1970s, and it focuses on a group of youth led by a young Mi'kmaq woman called Ayla who rebel against the colonial authorities, and specifically rebel against being forced to attend residential schools. The film is noteworthy for several reasons. Barnaby is known to use genre elements and specifically elements of horror films in his films, and he does so in Rhymes for Young Ghouls as well. He also uses other creative means like animated sequences, and specifically and most notably he plays around with the temporal dimensions of the film. As I said, it's set in the past, but it quite vividly shows how the history of residential schools, the history of forcefully removing Indigenous children from their families and communities to assimilate them into mainstream Canada via residential schools and other institutions like that, how that is not only a matter of the past, but how it has repercussions in the present, and how that still impacts the lives of Indigenous peoples, the lives of Indigenous communities, but also the lives of settlers today. So the film is very, very important. The film is very creative and it's very entertaining. So highly recommend it. The third film I'm recommending is a film by Diné filmmaker Sydney Freeland called Drunktown's Finest. Drunktown's Finest presents the stories of 3 different Diné characters on the Navajo Nation reservation, and it's particularly noteworthy for one of those stories, the story of Felicia, a trans person who for the most part of the film wants to leave the reservation because she's faced with severe transphobic sentiments. It's only towards the end of the film that she changes that wish, that she wants to stay, and that's after she learns from her traditional grandfather, a Diné medicine man, about traditional understandings of gender in Navajo society. Understandings of gender that acknowledge not only the existence of more than 2 gender categories, more than 2 gender identities, but ascribe special significance to those individuals who identify as Nadley, and that is the 3rd gender identity that Felicia identifies with. So the film is significant for that. It is one of the first Indigenous feature films that presents this more expansive history of gender identities in Indigenous communities, and does so quite skillfully. So highly recommended as well. My fourth recommendation is Taika Waititi's Boy. Taika Waititi is a Maori filmmaker, and to date he is the only Indigenous person who has received an Academy Award for his work. The award was not given out for the film Boy, but Boy, in my opinion, is his best film, the one that I would most recommend. Boy tells the story of the complex relationship between a young Maori boy growing up for the most part without his father, desperately awaiting the return of his father, who in reality is in prison, but in the mind of Boy is living through different adventures all over the world. And when the father ultimately returns, a lot of the expectations are disappointed, but yet in the end they still find towards each other and establish a good relationship. Boy is incredibly funny. It's also deep and it's also sad, and it's phenomenal storytelling. So a film that I can only highly recommend. The last item on my list is actually not a film, but a TV show called Reservation Dogs, which is co-produced by Taika Waititi and Seminole and Muskogee filmmaker Sterling Harjo. Reservation Dogs focuses on a group of Native youth who desperately want to leave their reservation in Oklahoma to find a better life in California. Yet time and again throughout the series, they are drawn back to their home, and ultimately they make peace with that. The show is incredibly funny, it's incredibly diverse, and it negotiates so many issues about contemporary Indigenous identities that it is a perfect end to this list. To receive the Fulbright Prize in American Studies means a lot to me. Fulbright Austria has been doing incredible work to facilitate cultural understanding between Austria and the United States for decades, through its exchange programs for scholars and for students, but also through awards like this. And to have my academic work recognized by that is significant, and it's a great, great honor.